Here I am in the German state of Brandenburg, around 70 kilometers east of Berlin. At the beginning of the 1980s, the Foresters Lodge behind me had very special guests. If the West German states had found out about them, it would have caused a serious crisis in the relations with East Germany. What is the connection between this Foresters Lodge, the East German state security, the Stasi, and the Rote Armee Faction, the RAF? Coming up. Hi and welcome to another East Germany investigated video. The Rote Armee Faction, the Rote Armee Fraktion, also known as the RAF, was the most well-known terrorist group in West Germany. They're held responsible for at least 34 murders and more than 200 injuries. The German Democratic Republic, although officially opposed to terrorism, supported the RAF. Why did they help them and how did they do it?
In 1968, West Germany was suddenly shocked by an arson attack on two Frankfurt department stores. It was the work of Andreas Baader, Gudrun Ensslin and two accomplices. 2 years later, in 1970, the Red Army faction, the RAF, was founded, and over the next 2 decades there followed a number of bombings, assassinations, kidnappings and robberies targeting state institutions, business leaders and US military personnel. How could such a violent organization come about? In the 1960s, more and more unrest started to take place among large numbers of young people of the generation that was born just after the Second World War. This youth rebellion took place in many Western countries and was led by university students who were disillusioned with the post-war society that their parents had built since 1945. And they were also horrified by America's war in Vietnam. The generation gap between parents and their teenage children was especially wide in West Germany, the land of the famous economic miracle, and the children born under that miracle now rejected it. Marxism, but not in its Soviet form, had become very fashionable among academics and was seen as the blueprint to replace the capitalist society of the West. In most countries, this movement did not lead to terrorism, but in West Germany it did. There was an additional powerful factor in Germany, the failure of denazification, which meant that former Nazis still held important government and business positions. Describing themselves as a communist and anti-imperialist guerrilla group, the RAF sought to overthrow the capitalist system, which they viewed as a continuation of fascism. They wanted to establish a revolutionary anti-imperialist Marxist society. The period in which the RAF was active can be divided into 3 generations. The first generation existed from its foundation in 1970 till 1977 and included the founders like Andreas Baader, Ulrike Meinhof and Gudrun Ensslin and was responsible for the group's most high-profile attacks. In May 1972, during the so-called May Offensive, the RAF executed a total of 6 attacks, the deadliest being the bombing of the Campbell Barracks, a US military base in Heidelberg, where 3 American soldiers were killed. The second generation of the RAF emerged after the arrests and deaths of the founding members in the mid-1970s. This group was active mainly from 1977 to the beginning of the 1980s, and it intensified the violence, carrying out high-profile assassinations, bombings and kidnappings. They were most notably responsible for the murder of Hans-Martin Schleyer, and they operated with greater secrecy and brutality, aiming to force the release of imprisoned members of their group and continue the anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist struggle of their predecessors. The third generation, which was active from the beginning of the 1980s to 1991, was more secretive and professionalized. Ideology was less prominent, and they focused on symbolic targets, including assassinations of top officials involved in industry and security. Their most notorious act was the 1991 murder of Detlef Rohwedder, the head of East German privatization, the Treuhandanstalt. Very soon after the foundation of the RAF, the East German Ministry of State Security, the Stasi, had started observing the RAF and closely followed their activities in West Germany. The Stasi enabled the first-generation RAF members, who were among the most wanted people in West Germany, to fly to their travel destinations, mainly the Middle East, departing from Schönefeld Airport in East Berlin. At the end of the 1970s, the first friction amongst the RAF members started to occur. The founders, Bada, Enslin and Meinhof, were dead, and the ideological views of the current members differed, leading to tensions. Some of them started to doubt whether the armed struggle involving a lot of violence was still justified. Internal disagreements resulted in members that renounced violence distancing themselves. The RAF started looking for countries where their former members could lead a safe life without risking to be arrested. They talked to the Stasi about the options in East Germany, which resulted in a strange kind of agreement. The Stasi offered their full support to ex-members of the RAF. The GDR would provide each of them with a new identity, housing and a job.
The innocent-looking Forester's Lodge behind me actually was a top-secret hideout for ex-RAF members. At this place, in August 1980, the Stasi received 8 RAF terrorists. They were allowed to choose a new name, a new date of birth and a new backstory. They had to sign that they had come to the GDR voluntarily, and they became unofficial employees of the Stasi, inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, which meant that they had to spy on others in their new working or social environment. It is also known that at the beginning of the 80s, active RAF members regularly visited the GDR to meet with the Stasi officials, which must have had a positive effect on their self-confidence.
Under the codename Stern, meaning star, the Stasi started an operation to manage and reduce the risks that came along with the activities of the RAF. At that time in West Germany, no one knew about the GDR support to the RAF. If they would have found out, it would have caused a serious international incident. The RAF members in the GDR were under complete control of the Stasi. For the GDR, this had the advantage that as long as they had RAF people in their country, they wouldn't have to be afraid of RAF attacks. And on the other hand, the active part of the RAF didn't have to be afraid that their former comrades in arms would suddenly go public. The Stasi was well informed about the ongoing investigations at the BKA, the Federal Criminal Police Office, the Bundeskriminalamt, so they knew where the West Germans were looking for which RAF member. Also, the Stasi had agents in the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, West Germany's security agency. In one case, the Stasi once helped the RAF to check if a person that was in touch with them was a West German agent. In return, the RAF gave the Stasi the complete files of a US military base in West Germany. In the mid-80s, the West German intelligence began to suspect that some RAF members were living in East Germany. 3 of them were identified, but they managed to stay under Stasi protection. The Stasi had to put in a lot of effort to make sure that the RAF members stayed unrecognized, such as by giving them new places to live, new identities, and in one case even plastic surgery. But it realized that things were getting too risky and it stopped accepting any more RAF members.
Based on the weapons and explosives that they used, in many cases it is proven or at least suspected that the RAF must have had support from other organizations. The Stasi was one of them. In the 1980s, RAF members also received military training in East Germany.
On September 15, 1981, RAF member Christian Kla shot at US General Frederick Rosen with a Soviet-made bazooka. He only just missed. It is now known that Kla received training in using the weapon in the GDR, although it is not certain if it was before or after the attack. The Stasi was definitely involved in the preparation of the attack. Many Arab secret services were trained by the Stasi, so there was a network that might have been used by the Stasi to support the RAF. For the murder of Alfred Herrhausen, the chairman of the Deutsche Bank, who was assassinated on November 30, 1989, a highly sophisticated roadside bomb was used. The crime remains unsolved, but the investigation proved that highly specialized skills were needed to employ this kind of bomb, indicating that the RAF received help, possibly from the Middle East. On April 1st, 1991, in a unified Germany where the Stasi no longer existed, another assassination took place, which nevertheless pointed in the direction of former East Germany. Detlef Rohwedder, the head of the Treuhandanstalt, the organization that had the task of privatizing the East German state enterprises, was shot dead by a sniper. The RAF claimed responsibility in a letter. Did the Stasi also play a role in Rohwedder's murder as an act of revenge? It was never proven, but it's possible that former Stasi agents were somehow involved. And the sniper might have obtained his training and weapon from a contact from the former Stasi network. But this was never proven either. The killing of Detlef Rohwedder was the last targeted RAF murder. After 1989, a different wind was blowing in Germany. The fall of the wall meant the end of the RAF. In June 1990, only a few months before the German reunification, all the ex-RAF members living in the GDR were arrested. It was easy to trace them down. The authorities checked the population register and looked for people who had come to live in the GDR. There weren't that many. All the RAF members living in East Germany were located within 1 day and arrested within the following 2 weeks. The RAF officially disbanded in 1998.
Although the RAF, as an illegal militant group, and the GDR, a repressive state, were very different, they both shared an anti-capitalist, Marxist-Leninist ideology, anti-fascist rhetoric, and the idea of being on the right side of history against capitalist exploitation. The East German Ministry of State Security saw the RAF terrorists as their brothers in arms, and its head, Erich Mielke, had plans to use them for sabotage acts in the West in case of conflict. It is not completely clear who else in the East German leadership knew about the connections with the RAF. In the Politburo, apart from Erich Mielke, probably no one, except for Erich Honecker, the leader of the GDR in the 70s and the 80s. He was almost certainly informed. So, even though the GDR regime officially rejected terrorism, they helped to keep the RAF going longer than it otherwise would have.